Please stand up and let's give Optimist Club welcome to Retired Colonel Gary Carlberg. Gary?
Thank you, David. Thank you. So, like he said, I'm Gary Carlberg. I live in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, so not far away from you. And the other thing I think I said to a couple people, Don is hard to say no to. So Don is a neighbor of a good friend of mine, Kurt Norman, and they invited me to come talk. Veterans Day is for all veterans, and so I'm honored to be here. We're going to be talking about all veterans, but I'm going to dive into more with the Civil War, and then also I added a different thing, Don, because we talked about this is all veterans. So I have another hat that I wear with the Minnesota Military Museum that I think will be of interest. Now, if there's anybody in the audience that would appreciate having this copy, sometimes we have people that can't see as well and they appreciate having a copy. And so I have one for you if you so desire. Anyway, so, let's see how this goes. Yeah. So, a little bit about me. When I started as a private in Mankato, Minnesota as a National Guard guy, did 22 years, retired from the National Guard, missed it, went in the Army Reserve, and then they deployed me just a couple times. So I did about 5 deployments. What's interesting is you take a look at the second from the left, I'm sitting on Hussein's throne in Iraq. And so Iraq was my first deployment in the Green Zone, and in one of my other deployments led me to FEMA, and if you see the Huey, or no, the Chinook helicopter, that's in Pakistan, and so what had happened before then is Hurricane Katrina happened, and FEMA, of course, didn't have near the people to take care of a disaster of that scale, and so like they did recently. They borrowed 1,500 soldiers from the Army to help out FEMA. And so I was part of the group that did the same thing in Katrina. And I'm going, what are all these retired Army guys doing? And they said, hey, you Army guys do 12-hour days, 7 days a week, sleep in cots, eat bad food, and drink chewy coffee and think it's great fun. We love you. And actually, one of my goals upon retirement was to be a FEMA guy. So I did that and was a FEMA chief of staff. So anyway, we just get back from Katrina, and like 3 weeks later, there's an earthquake in Pakistan that kills 80,000 people. Sides of the mountains slide off. Now, why we think North Carolina is a bad deal, multiply that by about 50, okay? And now winter is coming, and so the U.S. sends a military force, and I was part of that because we had just done Katrina and helped out in a coalition. My dad would have been a little interesting because the tent next to ours was from Japan, another group from the Army in Germany, and we were all working for the same cause, right? All for the good of man. A lot of stories there, but so that's Pakistan and up to the right. How I got into the Pentagon was on one of my deployments, we had these things they called the improvised explosive devices. In Vietnam, we had the booby traps. The nude weapon of de jure in Afghanistan and Iraq was the IED. And we had one of them go off and injured some people and things. And we take a look at what was triggering the IED. And I asked the commander, why are you so confused with a simple electronic circuit? He said, you're hired. And so really, from then on, I finished out another deployment, went off to some more education, and then got hired as a government civilian after I retired after 36 years in the Army with those 4 deployments. And in a couple of years, and my job there as, I would be the NATO keynote speaker when we're having a conference, international conference. There were countries that wanted to join take Obama's invitation to join the coalition in Afghanistan, but they didn't know how to fight an IED. And so my group was in charge of training them. So I spent a whole lot of time with other countries and how to get them the training programs and helping them to do things. Did some things with special ops, one of my favorite things, and I'm not going to get into classified. But, you know, if we find an IED cache of ammunition, IEDs, we would swap it out with ones that look the same. And when they went to test it, it would blow up on them. Oh, darn, I hate it when that happens, right? And then we would, with cyber, we would put messages in their emails and their trains and make it look like it was their supply chain that was corrupt and was asking for more money before they give them IEDs that worked. And so we took care of the rest of the problem on some of those supply chains. And not a US guy got shot in the process, right? So doing some pretty neat things. And obviously electronic warfare, jamming, just a whole bunch of different things that I got to do prototypes with. And so the IED is, of course, that one in the center with the bombs going off. And the bottom left is a robot that you use to render safe an IED. I am not a guy that could render safe a bomb. You do not want me to do that. But I managed the training programs, and at one hand time had $2.5 billion of funds for countering the IED. Okay, so obviously Veterans Day, big deal. Very important to veterans and to this country. It started out being called Armistice Day, and to honor all the veterans. They changed it from Armistice Day, which was kind of a European type thing, to obviously being on a Monday, and and after World War I, and we got Blackjack Pershing on the upper right-hand corner there, highest commander of guys in World War I from the U.S. But anyway, so the war ended at 11th hour, 11th day, on the 11th month of 1918, when the armistice went effect. But anyway, then we later on changed it to Veterans Day because it was more than just the World War I vets. So, the thing that Don, when we were talking about what should I talk about, I was going to talk about Civil War things, but really, since we're honoring all veterans, and I'm on the board of the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum, I thought, hey, let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a way to honor current veterans and those that have passed. And so, if one of the things we're trying to do is improve, the state has paid, provided, I think it's $32 million for the funding of the facility, the land and the design and the construction of the building. But we don't have the things for the displays, and so they have to work on that. We'll be talking more about that later. But one of the things we need to do is collect more of the uniforms and equipment, and also collect the veteran stories. Because as a veteran that lives in Minnesota, this is our museum for all of us in Minnesota to share. And so I am the VFW counterpartner, the guy that helps work between the museum and the VFW members. And so just recently I went to a veteran's nephew's house, and in World War II he'd been in an airborne engineering unit and had written a manuscript that his nephew didn't know what to do with, and he can't store it anymore. And it turns out that the guys at the museum were doing somersaults. This guy's story was awesome, and it's a Minnesota guy, and you know, this is the kind of information we need to be able to collect and be able to tell those stories. And so we're working on how we're going to collect your story, my story better. But anyway, so things there. Now, on the left-hand side is the groundbreaking. They did that a couple months ago. If you see a guy in the, not very well in that one, but I'm in a Civil War uniform there. First Minnesota was kind of one of the main big deals with Minnesota Civil War history, because Minnesota was I think the third youngest state in the nation when the Civil War was called. The Governor Ramsey, when Lincoln called for troops, Governor Ramsey offered the first 1,000. And so first Minnesota. And if you take a look at across this freeway from the Capitol, there's a statue. And on the top of the statue is just the likeness of Josiah King, who was the first guy in the first minute of sign up. So the first of the first. The other thing that's interesting is what happens in Duluth. Now, I also have General Joe Votel there. When he was the Central Command commander, so he's a 4-star general, and so he's the general in CENTCOM that's in charge of all the battles that are going on in the Middle East. And so, pretty important guy in the U.S. system. And so I wasn't on his staff a long time, was backfilling a guy that was deployed, and so I was there with him. And so that was kind of fun to be with another Minnesota guy. But anyway, he is a retired 4-star from Minnesota, living in Minnesota. So it's kind of interesting that General Vesey, the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff from during the Vietnam era, came from Minnesota. And then we got General Joe Votel. And here in Ramsey County is General Paul Nakasone, 4-star general. They kept him on for another couple of years during, as the cyber command guy in Intel because of all the cyber warfare. If you guys don't understand it, World War III is going on as we speak in the cyber world. And so DoD can't do anything, shouldn't do anything, congressional, stuff. We do things, DoD does stuff outside of the United States. DOJ, Department of Homeland Security, it covers things on the inside. But what was interesting, I'm in a meeting and, I've been a retired colonel. I'm now a government civilian manager, pretty high level, because now the colonels are working for me. That's kind of interesting. And then, so I'm talking to him, and this guy behind me says, "Where are you from?" And I say, "Minnesota." And he says, "I got that figured out." And it turned out that was Paul Nakasone, 3-star general. And so it was kind of fun to meet the guy and he grew up 3 houses from where I live now. And so, and we just invited him to speak on Memorial Day in White Bear Lake in the Union Cemetery. So anyway, Joe Votel is one of the guys that was one of the keynote speakers at the groundbreaking of the Minnesota Military Museum. All right, if you notice, in the very front of the building in the front of the museum is a likeness of a submarine under the ground, kind of coming up. Must have been there for a while because it's turning green, right? But actually it's the USS Minnesota that has been decommissioned, and they took it apart for scraps. But we as the museum were able to get the tower and the tail from the real submarine. And yes, it's going to cost a couple $100,000 to get it up and going, but that might be something you might have a lot of fun seeing. And speaking of submarines, did you guys know that in World War II, the first United States weapon that was fired in Pearl Harbor was off the USS Ward with reservists, naval reservists from Minnesota. And they shot at a Japanese mini-sub. And so a lot of Minnesota history right there. That weapon, cannon is by the Adjutant General's Office, the Veterans Service Building. The intent is to have that also come up here for the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum. So, interesting things there. All right, to give you a little idea what's going on, this is the plan for the inside, and by the way, the groundbreaking is done. The construction has started. They're working on the basement, the main platform. The intent is to have the walls up this fall and the roof on this winter. So things are happening. So just a little bit, it's a big building, 40,000 square feet. Just a couple shots of the galleries on the inside, and yeah, from the distance you're not going to be able to see it very well, but the bottom line is basically every major war will have their own exhibit. And then we have other classrooms, and then we have places where we do rotating exhibits. All right, and another one with more of those. And I would like to do a quote. The guy in the picture is Minnesota VFW Commander Dave Stalin, a friend of mine. And bottom line is really, as veterans, this is our military museum to share our story and information to our families, friends, and neighbors in Minnesota. And what Dave said was, as military veterans, the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum is our museum. I encourage all VFW posts and individual VF members to support by sharing your story, donating uniforms and equipment, and making financial contributions. The goal is to have several new exhibits developed, but they need our help. The state of Minnesota paid for the building. They did not provide money for the exhibits. So it makes sense that we need to do a fundraiser, and if people are going, well, how does that work? Actually, that's how all museums seem to work. The museum is not a profit-making adventure at all. But it helps to have those contributions. And we had one individual whose father was in World War II that donated $1 million. So we're significantly making progress on a big goal. Now I want to talk a little bit more about what I originally was going to talk about, and that's this Operation Headstone. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but so the page on your page has a little bit about the museum on the background with more information if you want to make a donation or want to come up and see it. When it's open in September, there's information on the backside. And on the other side, it talks about Operation Headstone with much more detail, something you can take away with you. So, I am the commander of the Minnesota Camp 56 SUV-CW, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, only camp in Minnesota. I came from Virginia, where I was working there, obviously, in the Pentagon. I did a lot of reenactments and got to enjoy doing some things. Joined this particular research group in Virginia, came to Minnesota, and they hadn't started. Now, I hate to admit that Minnesota has not done well in recording where our Civil War veterans are interred for their final resting place. And so that's one of the things that we try to do, is find that out. So we do this research using a lot of, if anybody's, either they or someone they know builds a family tree, it's a lot of those genealogy type research skills to find these guys, and also looking at a lot of databases and using spreadsheets and put it all together. So the Sons of Union Veterans, we came from the descendants of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, to back that up, after the Civil War, a lot of the Union veterans were concerned that the South was going to rise again. And so they kind of like to have sort of a ad hoc militia. And the other thing is for those familiar with the VFWs and Legions, for veterans to get together and be able to talk about some of the terrors of combat and those type of things, it's actually a very good thing. They had tried to do something like that with the Mexican-American War, and after those guys had passed away, it ended. And for the Sons of Union Veterans, actually after the Civil War, with General Grant becoming President Grant, and so many of Americans that had been in the Civil War, the Grand Army of the Republic, kind of like the Legion or VFW, was actually the most powerful lobby group in the United States. Well, Minnesota had a huge department and a lot of camps, but as these guys got older, they realized the good work they're doing isn't going to continue anymore, so their sons continued to work. So my great-grandfather was a Civil War soldier, so I'm eligible. We also have associates where they don't have any relatives at all, but like to do the research and like what we do. And by the way, ladies, by the name, titled organization Sons, we don't have any female members, but my best researcher and two of the other top ones are women. And so they aren't officially members, but they contribute to the team as much or better than other guys. And so it takes a team to get it done. And so all good there. So one of the national charge we're doing is to find where every Union soldier is buried in the United States. The Confederates are doing the same thing. If I find that where a Confederate soldier is buried, I send an email to a guy that does the same thing. And what's cool is I recently joined forces with a group that's doing work on colored troops, and they didn't have a clue how many colored troops had fought in the Civil War on the Union side, and then came to Minnesota and lived and are buried here. So, you know, by working together, a lot of synergy and a lot of great stories and sharing of that. So, pretty cool stuff. So, what we do is we search by county and get all those, find all of them and then where they're buried. And we have a ceremony for them. And then the bottom right-hand side of that photo, there's a group where we did it, Duluth, Minnesota, for this guy by the name of Albert Wilson. Why is Albert Wilson a big deal? Well, you know, we had the first soldier of the Civil War. Albert Wilson was the last Civil War soldier to die in the United States, Union or Confederate. We didn't have a single battle here, Ann, but yet we had the bookends. And so, you know, we contributed soldiers to the Civil War. We had the Indian Wars, but it's interesting. And so when we did St. Louis County, which includes Duluth, by the Duluth Historical Center, is this statue that you see in the top part of the photo. But if you go to Gettysburg, on the Battle of Gettysburg is a duplicate statue of Albert Wilson, because Albert's a big deal in the Civil War world. So pretty cool. We had a big ceremony for him. So, as we do each of these research, then we do a ceremony. And so far we've done basically 2/3 of the state of Minnesota. The first year that we did this, we did 2 states and we thought we were hot stuff. Last year and this year, or did 2 counties. Last year and this year we did 23 counties each year. But I also have like 15 researchers instead of 2. And so we learn a lot. And the other thing we do is once we find all these guys, what good does it do to have that information in my spreadsheet that no one else can see? So we load the data on each of these soldiers into a national database that a lot of other databases reach to. So if you're building your family tree, you're doing research, the tools what you're probably using, most of them reach out to this database to find the data. Or you can do the research by going to this link yourself. And the other thing that we offer is, if you would like, we can do the research for you on your Civil War relative. In particular, I can get from the National Archives places where a lot of that soldier's data is that the average person doesn't know where to find. So some of the things that you can see, it's not only the name, the rank, what unit he was in, when did he born, when did he die, when did he serve, but we also do a little bio paragraph. And then we reference to Find a Grave, which is those that have done any genealogy. And in that, we do provide the same paragraph. And then we also, on Find a Grave, attach things like the pension records, service records, so it's real easy for the average person to find. So trying to make this data available to you. So 24,500 soldiers from Minnesota served in the Civil War. That's a lot of people for the 3rd youngest state in the Union, right? Wow. So if we were only doing 4,500, now that we've got about 12,000, you'd think we're halfway there. Here's the challenge. Some of those guys that started out in Minnesota, as they got older, they didn't have nursing homes in the 1800s, early 1900s. So you went to live with one of your daughters or sons as you got old and couldn't take care of yourself. So a lot of times, son or daughter, like now, they went to someplace else for their careers. And so these guys are going to different states, different counties. And so some of the guys were not buried here. We had the gold rush not far after the Civil War. So a lot of guys went west. But Minnesota had thousands of acres that if you lived on the land for 5 years, it was yours for free. And if you were in the Union Army, like 1st Minnesota, and you served Chuck for 3 years, instead of having to sit there for 5 years before it's yours, you only had to be there 2 more, and it's your land free and clear. So a lot of the guys that had never left the county they lived in before the Civil War are all of a sudden, they've gone all over the place in the war, and they're not afraid to go anywhere, so they marry that cute girl that they went to school with, and they off to a new land, and the ground in Minnesota, oh, if you read some of these guys talking about, you know, especially those that immigrated from Norway are the ones I have the most interest in, where the ground was so depleted after thousands of years of no fertilization, they come to Minnesota and it's pure black 12 inches down. Oh my gosh, what a great place to come. So we had thousands, in some counties we have 40% more Civil War troops from other states buried here than we had from Minnesota. Found a soldier that won the Medal of Honor, highest military award you can get. And that's his headstone on the right-hand side. Nothing about military Medal of Honor. And by the way, his grandson is Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger, retired. How can we have a tragedy of military? Is anybody, the veterans here, it's like, oh, not having a headstone is one bad thing, but not having a marker if you're a Medal of Honor winner? Holy cow. And so I'm working with the Medal of Honor Society, and here's the problem. The Army regulations that govern the VA for, the VA regulations that govern what you can do, if you already have a headstone, they can't give you a military one. Well, he's already got a headstone. And the family doesn't want to get rid of the headstone that's been there for 100 years. And they could put a thing that says he's a military MH recipient that you put on a huge headstone, but it would be bigger than the footstone he's got. And so there are, I guess, like over 50 Medal of Honor recipients across the nation that have the same issue. And so I propose that maybe the VFWs in Minnesota will be willing to pay for the money to buy a mold and do a smaller version of this big one they do, because we need to take care of our veterans. So anyway, that's one of the things that came up with. The other guy, this Captain Holbrook that I found this last week in Hennepin County, he's a Medal of Honor recipient, but not a congressional. And what's interesting, in the Civil War, the Army and the Navy did Medal of Honor winners, but there wasn't a Congressional Medal of Honor. But he is I think it's 12th Corps, or 17th Corps, 17th Corps Medal of Honor, which not is an Army one, it's not a Navy one, it's not a Congressional one, so this guy, but it's interesting. So, finally getting to Operation Headstone. As we're doing all this research, we're finding, looking for these soldiers, we're finding there are hundreds without a headstone. Now, why does a veteran not have a headstone? The headstone is free. What's wrong with this picture? Well, the VA didn't start giving headstones for free until probably, I think it was just a little before the World War I type era. And if these guys did have a headstone, it was a wooden one. Can anybody want to guess how much is left 100 years later? And in the one cemetery in Hennepin County that I'm doing now the research on, they have like 800 soldiers without a headstone in one cemetery. And so they're not far, Hennepin County, Lakewood Cemetery, beautiful cemetery, but one of the oldest ones in the state of Minnesota, beautiful, very patriotic, and there still is this Minnesota Soldiers Home, which was basically a nursing home for veterans, but with not the same kind of medical care you get now. And so these guys, if they had no family, widowed, no kids, whatever, they would come here and die. And there's nobody that would deal with it. And so the government bought him a plot and maybe a wooden cross. And so anyway, the other problem that still exists is the headstone is free, but the cemetery seems to think they should pay their people that put the headstones in the ground, should probably pay them a living wage. So they have a cost of doing business. So I have several cemeteries that'll do one for free out of patriotism. But if you've got 800, ain't gonna happen. And so we have cut some deals, and so and so I have a Civil War discount where I'm getting a lot of them done. September 29th, we had a headstone dedication ceremony at Lakewood Cemetery. We did 106 new footstones. That's the little one. And that sounds like a lot, but that's for the soldiers whose last name started with A or B. I will be there to watch. For those soldiers whose last names start with C through G, we have 187 forms ready to go. And I just did H, finished that up last night, and I've got 80 names. Now, those 80 aren't finalized, I need to do some more, but there's a lot of work to be done for the country. So, just for those that haven't gone to a Civil War cemetery ceremony, I'm going to kind of take you to a visual one here. Beautiful Minnesota fall day. Couldn't ask for better weather. A little bit sunny. Had a crowd of about 125. And if I had the internet to work, the ceremony, as I'm introducing myself and what we're doing, there's this music in the background. It's a Civil War fife and drum group coming down the hill towards the ceremony. Talk about starting a Civil War ceremony, right? Okay. And so, and the first Minnesota guys that I'm with, glad to do it. Well, there we go. So, makes you feel like you're there already, right? One of the biggest compliments we got from one of the families that from a ceremony was, my great-grandfather finally got the ceremony he should have gotten 104 years ago. Now that is quite the deal. So, and a lot of us come in the Civil War uniform. Obviously, these guys fife and drum and muskets. In the upper left, I'm talking, and the middle guy there talking is the VA commissioner from the state of Minnesota. And he's a little appalled. He didn't realize that Minnesota had hundreds of soldiers without a headstone, and so he's helping us out as way he can. For those in the military, three guys in the upper right-hand corner, they're kind of leaning over on their rifles upside down. That's no longer a current ceremonial thing. That was done in the Civil War during funerals in the cemetery. It's called Rest on Arms, so we do that then. In the bottom right, or bottom left, you can't see this real well, but we have a weeping widow that comes to these ceremonies, all in black. I mean, talk about some of these things, and women and children, and women in hoop skirts, and children in clothing of the era, and guys too, not just uniforms. And then, of course, and when you're done with the ceremony, if we have the VFW there, a lot of times we'll have our guys fire first. And as you can see, when you're firing a black powder Springfield rifle, there's a lot of smoke. And it's always interesting, we ask the little kids, okay, now time the Civil War guys to see how long it takes them to reload. And 2 minutes later, they're reloading. And the VFW guys with their Vietnam era M1s or whatever it is, boom, 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 semi-automatics. And so, it's always fun for the kids to see that, but a lot of fun and historically correct information. Speaking of the VFWs, I had one VFW guy that's done probably a couple hundred ceremonies in the last couple of years. And he's going, Gary, I didn't watch the speakers. I watched the 20 descendants that you invited through Ancestry.com. Who would have thought it would have been so moving to have a ceremony for your great-grandfather from 105 years ago, to have a ceremony, and who would think it was, and he says, this is awesome, Gary, I want to come to every one you do in our area. So pretty cool. So, and at the end, who has not heard taps at a military funeral, right? Well, in a Civil War funeral, they started doing something by accident where they played taps by a canyon, and it echoed. So if you notice, I have not one bugler, I have two. We play echo taps. And if you think that taps, taps puts a sting up my spine every time they play it. But echo taps, it's beautiful and haunting at the same time. Now, you cannot use echo taps in the current military funeral, but I'm doing an 1800s funeral, right? So, a couple things you can do to help us out. Some of the biggest challenges are, you know, my families were farmers. And why would you pay for a cemetery plot when you can bury them in your own backyard? So we've got lots of these guys that are buried in other places, so we need help with that. Need people to help with research, help finding descendants, and some of these other things. So that concludes what I've done. Wanted to visit with you about. Thank you very much, and thank you for all our my other fellow veterans that have served this country.